Everything collapsed the moment emergency power met resistance from inside the system. The attempt to invoke emergency war authority was designed to be clean and overwhelming. Under existing statutes, the executive can accelerate military posture, bypass ordinary consultation, and compress decision timelines to hours instead of weeks. It is a mechanism built for shock, not debate. Historically, it works because it assumes unified institutions, disciplined silence, and fear of delay. In moments of crisis, speed becomes legitimacy, and legitimacy becomes obedience. This move followed that exact logic. Rising international tension demanded a show of decisiveness. Markets were jittery, allies uncertain, adversaries testing boundaries. Emergency authority promised instant clarity, one voice, one command, one direction. The calculation was simple: act faster than opposition can organize, and resistance never materializes. That assumption has held for decades because the system usually protects itself first. But this time it didn't. The first fracture did not come from courts, protest, or foreign pressure. It came from inside the architecture meant to absorb and amplify executive will. Senators did not leak outrage or posture for cameras. They moved procedurally, quietly, and with precision. Legal objections were filed, holds were placed, and authorization timelines were disrupted without spectacle. This was not defiance as theater. It was institutional refusal. Emergency power depends on compliance across agencies, funding streams, and legal validation. Once even a narrow segment of that chain resists, certainty evaporates. The authority still exists on paper, but its force becomes conditional, delayed, and vulnerable. For the first time, the emergency mechanism revealed a flaw. It was never designed to survive. Opposition inside the Senate did not arrive as outrage. It arrived as process. Within hours, holds were placed on authorizations required to operationalize emergency war authority. Committee chairs delayed certifications. Calendars were adjusted. None of it was loud. All of it was effective. The chamber understands that power is exercised through timing, not speeches, and timing was immediately denied. This resistance formed across ideological lines, not as a coalition, but as parallel decisions reaching the same conclusion. Emergency authority requires institutional consent to function. Without appropriations alignment, without confirmations, without statutory acknowledgement, the order cannot travel down the chain of command intact. That is not defiance. It is constitutional friction, applied deliberately and without apology. The critical realization was speed. This was not a reaction that gathered momentum over days. It was pre-positioned. Procedures existed, drafts were ready, and legal staff moved before messaging teams could shape a narrative. That alone signaled seriousness. Symbolic dissent waits for cameras. Functional obstruction moves before the public notices. Markets registered the shift immediately. Defense contractors paused guidance. Energy prices stalled instead of spiking. Currency traders read paralysis, not escalation. The Senate did not announce its resistance, but the financial system understood the implication. Executive certainty had been interrupted, and interruption changes risk calculations. Procedurally, each block compounded the next. A delayed vote triggered secondary reviews. Secondary reviews froze transfers. Frozen transfers stalled commands already drafted. The system is built to slow itself when legitimacy is contested, and here legitimacy was quietly contested at every junction, transforming emergency authority into an untested assertion rather than an executable order. Silence became the most destabilizing element. No press conferences, no grandstanding, just a widening gap between asserted authority and executable power. Every hour without resolution hardened the blockade, because delay itself recalibrates legitimacy. The unresolved question was no longer political loyalty, but whether the executive could force movement through a system that had already decided to stop. Emergency war authority is often described as absolute, but the statute tells a narrower story. It authorizes rapid military posture changes, accelerated deployments, and temporary bypass of consultation requirements. It does not suspend appropriations law, erase oversight triggers, or nullify judicial review. Those limits are usually invisible because compliance makes them irrelevant. When institutions move together, emergency power feels unlimited. The current resistance dragged those limits into the open. Legal scholars pointed to dormant clauses rarely tested outside constitutional crises. Notification windows that were treated as formalities became enforceable deadlines. Funding authorities tied to explicit congressional consent suddenly mattered. Emergency declarations initiate power, but they do not complete it. Completion requires downstream legality, and that legality was now contested. Historically, emergency authority expands through silence. After past conflicts, courts deferred, legislators retroactively approved, and precedents hardened. Power grew because no one forced clarification. This time, clarification was forced immediately. Senate action converted, assumed discretion into a justiciable question. That shift alone altered the balance. Law replaced momentum. Timelines tightened. Military planners require legal certainty to issue executable orders. Agencies require indemnification to act. Contractors require assurances to move assets. Each hour without clarity increased exposure for anyone executing an order that might later be ruled defective. Risk migrated downward, and with it, hesitation. The exposure carried psychological weight. Emergency authority relies on the belief that it cannot be stopped once declared. When that belief cracks, every actor reassesses personal liability. Scholars warned that acting under disputed authority creates individual risk, not just institutional risk. That warning circulated quietly, but its effect was immediate. What remained unsettled was enforcement. Courts could intervene or they could refuse speed. Countermeasures could be attempted or abandoned as legally combustible. The power still existed, but it was no longer insulated, and insulation is what emergency authority depends on. Outside Washington, reaction was measured and revealing. Allied governments did not denounce or endorse, they slowed. Joint statements were delayed, coordination calls postponed, liaison officers instructed to wait for legal clarity. This was not confusion, it was risk management. Alliances operate on reliability, and reliability is demonstrated through execution, not intent. Defense ministries adjusted quietly. Contingency plans were reclassified from active to conditional. Logistics windows narrowed. Transit permissions were left unsigned. Diplomats emphasized routine language while avoiding commitments that would bind them to an authority whose domestic foundation appeared unsettled. Silence again carried meaning. Adversaries watched without provocation. Intelligence services tracked legislative calendars as closely as troop movements. State media shifted tone from confrontation to observation, framing the moment as procedural rather than confrontational. Markets in those regions reflected the same assessment. Volatility softened, insurance premiums recalibrated, shipping routes held. Delay was being priced as information. The narrative turn was external confirmation. What began as internal legal friction now registered globally as a constraint on power projection. No speech corrected it. No briefing reversed it. The system abroad responds to capability signals, and capability depends on unbroken authority. Legislative paralysis, even temporary, broadcasts limitation. Historical patterns reinforced caution. Allies remember moments when emergency assertions outpaced legal backing, leaving partners exposed after the fact. Those memories produce discipline. Cooperation pauses until legitimacy is reestablished. That pause is not punishment, it is self-preservation. Time itself became a strategic variable. Each day without alignment hardened alternative plans. Quiet hedging expanded. The longer coordination stalled, the more costly reactivation would become. Credibility does not collapse loudly. It thins, increment by increment, until action requires persuasion instead of assumption. Communications channels stayed open, but substance drained away, replaced by careful listening, annotated pauses, and requests for confirmation that never arrived. Whether that thinning could be reversed quickly enough remained unanswered, and every unanswered hour made the question heavier. Internal strain eventually surfaced, not as scandal, but as documentation. Conflicting briefings reached reporters within hours of each other, each technically accurate, collectively incompatible. Legal memoranda circulated internally, then externally, outlining risk exposure and compliance gaps. None accused, none defended. They simply described constraints. In an environment built on command certainty, description itself became destabilizing. Resignations followed the same pattern, quiet, procedural, and carefully worded. Senior staff stepped aside, citing timing, not disagreement. Advisors requested reassignment rather than dismissal. The exits were orderly, but their accumulation mattered. Every departure signaled personal risk assessment, overriding institutional momentum. Authority erodes fastest when insiders begin pricing liability instead of loyalty. Public perception shifted accordingly. Markets reacted less to policy than to coherence. Volatility clustered around press windows, not announcements. Defense-linked equities hesitated. Bond yields reflected caution rather than confidence. Investors did not need confirmation of failure. They needed confirmation of alignment, and alignment was absent. Exposure replaced speculation. Operational pressure intensified. Time-sensitive decisions stalled because no one wanted to be the last signature on a disputed order. Each delay triggered review protocols. Each review widened the circle of accountability. Bureaucratic safeguards, designed for oversight, became friction under stress. The system slowed itself to avoid absorbing irreversible damage. This was not a collapse driven by opposition. It was corrosion driven by visibility. Emergency authority depends on the presumption that internal disagreement remains internal. Once dissent becomes observable, the authority no longer feels emergency. It feels provisional. Provisional power invites scrutiny, and scrutiny invites hesitation. The reputational cost compounded daily. International counterparts adjusted tone. Domestic institutions adjusted posture. Even supportive actors hedged language, preserving deniability. Consolidation requires confidence, and confidence requires silence. Here, silence was impossible because documentation had already replaced discretion. Whether authority could be reassembled under this exposure remained uncertain, but every additional memo, exit, and delay narrowed the space for recovery. The decisive shift occurred without announcement. Institutional actors stopped asking what was wanted and started asking what was permitted. General counsels asserted review authority. Inspectors flagged exposure. Career officials documented compliance thresholds and declined actions that exceeded them. No one framed it as resistance. It was framed as obligation. Statute replaced instruction. Enforcement pathways activated automatically. When authority is disputed, protocols require written justification, cross-signature, and indemnification review. Each requirement narrowed the field of action. Orders were returned for clarification. Clarifications triggered additional review. The process was not adversarial, it was mechanical. Law does not argue. It checks boxes, and unchecked boxes halt movement. The power of refusal proved decisive because it was silent. No dramatic rejection was necessary. Non-compliance emerged through delay, redirection, and procedural exhaustion. Agencies are designed to function this way under stress. Loyalty accelerates action, law decelerates it. Once deceleration begins, momentum cannot be restored by force alone. Risk calculus shifted sharply. Executing disputed authority exposed individuals to post hoc liability. Declining to execute exposed no one. That asymmetry mattered. Career officials understand that political protection is temporary, but legal records are permanent. When that understanding spreads, action freezes at the margins and collapses inward. Historical precedent reinforced the choice. Past emergencies where loyalty overrode legality produced investigations, sanctions, and careers quietly ended years later. Those lessons are institutional memory. They surface precisely when pressure peaks. This was not defiance born of ideology. It was survival logic applied systematically. Options narrowed rapidly. Countermeasures required broader compliance, which no longer existed. Escalation increased exposure without increasing control. Retreat preserved position, but conceded authority. Every available move carried consequence, and consequence now belonged to law, not command. The assertion of primacy was irreversible. Emergency authority depends on belief. Legal authority depends on record. Once records accumulate, belief becomes irrelevant. What remained unresolved was where the reckoning would land: courtroom, legislature, or history. But the system had already chosen the framework that would decide it. The verdict arrived without ceremony. Emergency war authority was not overturned. It was bounded. The confrontation fixed a limit that had long existed but rarely mattered. Executive power could initiate urgency, but it could not compel compliance absent statutory alignment. That distinction now stands recorded, cited, and enforceable. This outcome redefines the mechanism itself. Emergency authority no longer functions as an unstoppable accelerator. It functions as a request that triggers review under pressure. Institutions absorbed the shock and corrected course exactly as designed. The system did not need consensus. It needed friction, documentation, and time. Those elements converted assertion into evidence and evidence into consequence. Individuals absorb the cost because systems do not apologize. Careers narrow. Influence contracts. The informal protections that accompany command dissolve once legality becomes the governing language. This is not punishment administered by opponents. It is the predictable result of forcing exceptional power through ordinary law. History records many such moments, and the pattern is consistent. Markets adjusted to permanence. Risk premiums recalibrated. Allies resumed engagement on narrower terms. Adversaries updated assessments and moved on. The crisis did not escalate into catastrophe because the correction arrived before execution. That correction carries its own price: diminished discretion, reduced surprise, and permanent scrutiny. No redemption arc exists here. Authority does not recover by insisting harder. Once limits are demonstrated, they persist. Future assertions will be weighed against this record, not against rhetoric. Emergency power remains available, but its aura is gone. It is now procedural, conditional, and contestable. This boundary will shape doctrine, training, and expectation. Legal memos become templates. Legislative staff memorialize the sequence. Commanders internalize the constraint. The cost of overreach is now measurable, not abstract. Every future crisis will carry this memory, narrowing choices before any declaration is even drafted. The final judgment belongs to structure, not personality. A system confronted a stress test and responded by constraining excess. That response will govern future decisions regardless of who occupies office. The illusion that speed alone confers legitimacy has been dissolved, and nothing replaces it except law.